This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for a wonderful event today. Today, we're going to be launching a wonderful writer's book. Aruni Kashyap is here with us. Aruni, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for organizing this in the middle of an extraordinary challenging situation. Thank you so much.
No, but I think the introduction is not done yet. I really thought about how to introduce you, and I realized that the best way to introduce you would be to talk about how I first discovered your work. Almost 7 years ago, I got a wonderful email from Bhakti, which was almost like, "Do you have time to do a really good review?" And I was like, yes. And then Bhakti was like, "This is really great writer, and you have to review his book." And that's when I received your book. And it took me about 2 months to read and learn and review your book. And it was also my first introduction to Assam, its politics. And I just not only learned so much about you as a writer, but also about was a wonderful introduction to me, to the region, to think about things. So thank you so much. But that is not your only achievement. So I'm going to very quickly also read out your wonderful other achievements. Aruni Kashyap is an author, he's an editor, he's a translator. He's the author of His Father's Disease, with Context India in 2019, a novel, The House of a Thousand Stories from Penguin 2013, a poetry collection called There Is No Good Time for Bad News. And then he's also the assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Georgia. So, Aruni, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you again for that beautiful introduction. I think I wrote House of a Thousand Stories almost a lifetime ago, so it's amazing when someone talks about it. I was really stupid and very young when I wrote that book.
My first thing was when I was reading your book, I kept thinking, I just wanted to. About a year ago, before I read your book, is when I had the sense of clarity that I wanted to be a writer. But I'd already trained to be a lawyer. And when I read your book, I was like, oh my God, how old is he? Like, how is it possible that someone as old as me could write a book like this and lived three lifetimes to write something like this? So, thank you so much.
Thank you. That's absolutely touching. I am going to quickly share an anecdote with you. In fact, I was invited as a chief, one of the speakers to a conference in
Mm-hmm.
India after this book was released.
Mm-hmm.
And when they met me, they were very, very disappointed to see that I was so young because they just read my bio and found my email ID and wrote to me after reading the book.
You don't look a day more than 16. So I'm going to, after this, I'm going to ask you your skincare routine as well, which I might actually benefit from. Um, but before that, we have a couple of audience questions. I had mine, but I think the audience questions are much better. So the first one is, Aruni Kashyap, what made you become a writer?
I always like to say that's a very beautiful question. I always like to say that writing chose me because, and it sounds really sort of, you know, very romantic and somehow mysterious, but it is not. I always loved writing, and I always wrote from a very young age. But maybe I sometimes when I try to sort of reason it, I understand maybe because I saw my mother writing in the early 90s when I was growing up. My mother is a novelist, and she's no more, but she was a novelist. She wrote two novels and many short stories. So she was writing her first novel when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I could read Assamese very well. And it was her work that kind of
Mm-hmm.
inspired me because in so many ways her novel was the novel that I read, and she was actually writing the novel because she thought she would not live because she was very sick at that point of time.
Mm-hmm.
So she wanted to write this semi-autobiographical novel so that I would grow up and read. But I was already reading it at 9 years of age, and she was very, very embarrassed about it because it was a very frank autobiography, about autobiographical novel about growing up as a woman in the 1960s and 1970s in small town Assam. So she thought that I would have ideas about her, love life, if I read the novel. So she always used to be very upset with me. So I would say my mother and my father is also a writer, but he writes nonfiction. They both are writers. I think I was inspired by them. I also had the privilege of having books around me. So I
Mm-hmm.
think all of these factors contributed. But I just loved writing always.
Oh, that's wonderful. But we have another question from the audience question, which I'm also going to add my own question to. How much of the fiction you write is a reflection of your own life? And when I was reading the first story, the Skylark Girl, and this question about, she asks this question about, oh, why do you write about folk tales but not the violence in your in Assam? This went through my head as well. I was thinking, if was this something that someone asked you when you became this writer and started having more of a public profile?
Yes and no. I have been asked that question, and many other writers from the Northeast also, I think, face that question very often. I do this answer that question with full detail, but I'm not going to be very elaborate. We have to understand that the English writing from Northeast started getting published in large amount only in the last 20 years. Before that, there used to be English writing from Northeast, but a lot of that was locally published and was not available nationally through national press. Due to the work of some editors and some publishing houses, this became a larger and larger body of work since the early 2000s. And what happened was that before that, there was a lot of scholarship about Northeast, and a lot of this scholarship focused on anthropology and history and sociology of the North societies and the cultures from the Northeast. So the academic work on the societies of Northeast actually in English preceded the fiction that was and poetry that was coming out of Northeast in English. But for a long time, of course, other languages, non-English languages, always produce writing from the Northeast. So what happens is that because Northeast has been ravaged by so much violence for a very long time, as a result of that, the only questions that people, only images that people had for a long time was of violence. So when Northeastern writers started getting attention, and one of the reasons that a lot of Northeastern writers also started getting attention because there's so little available from the Northeast in the Indian mainstream. So if you wrote something that was topical, people usually sort of read it, and as a result, there was this strange kind of conversation that started emerging. I think that are you writing violence because it is exciting and more marketable? Why don't you write about other things? Because as Northeastern writers started writing about the violence, and more work started getting translated about the insurgencies, what was happening was also we are also seeing a critique of the Indian nation state and the brutalities of it. As a result, people became more and more uncomfortable. So this is the context that that this question emerges. But I have been asked the question multiple times. People have also asked me questions very often that when are you going to stop writing about Assam or Northeast? Why don't you write a story in set in Delhi, as if that would make me that is like a more a challenging artistic enterprise instead of writing about Assam. And I think a lot of these questions are very similar to questions that writers from underrepresented regions actually face. So this story was a way of addressing that, but I also did not want to leave any straightforward answers. I also wanted the writer who is facing this to be a little prickly, a little upset, and at the same time, the person who is posing this question to be also little, also sort of very sensitive, who would just break down because she got a prickly reply. So I wanted all of these forces to sort of work together and create a sort of setting where I'm able to pose these questions and allow the readers to just think about it. That should a writer from underrepresented region write in order to fill a vacuum in journalism, or should a is a writer should does a writer from an underrepresented region have the autonomy to choose whatever they want to write? I think these are very important questions to ask, and I think I'm able to ask those questions also primarily because I inhabit two literary traditions, writing in Assamese and writing in English. So I was able to bring that conversation. When I write about any topic in Assamese, nobody asks me why I'm writing about this topic. It's just there. They evaluate it on the basis of is this good or bad, I like it, I don't like it. That's it. But when I'm writing in English, because so little from the Northeast is known outside Northeast, so little from Assam is known outside Assam, as a result, people start asking, are you writing to gain attention? Are you writing to market your work? Are you cheapening your work? Is there an agenda? All of these questions are sort of asked, and I think it's it's disparaging because none of them are literary questions.
Hmm. Do you feel that often writers from underrepresented communities are never asked literary questions? Rather, you're asked to be native informants. For example, often I see white writers or already established successful writers being asked questions about their process, how do they think, and yet brown and black writers are often only asked to be native informants of apparently these exotic communities that they come from.
Absolutely, and I think that is across the board. I work in America. I teach multicultural American literature. I teach writers from the global South. These are questions that often come up when I see literary discussions,
Mm-hmm.
both both in book festivals or literary conferences where writers from underrepresented literary cultures, they are asked these kind of questions, and it's and I'm not surprised at all because I have been asked those questions repeatedly. As I said, I've been even asked to stop writing about Assam so that I can prove that I'm a good writer by setting my novel or short stories in Delhi, which I
Mm-hmm.
have done, but I have done it in Assamese.
So we are going to go to another audience question, but we have Sonia Kamal who says hi. I don't know if you know Sonia Kamal.
Yes, Sonia is a friend and a great writer, and she lives in Atlanta, so another Georgia person.
And then we also have Rizwan Azarika saying that good to see you, Arunida.
Okay,
Yeah,
hi
and now
Rizwan, nice to meet you. Lovely.
so our third question. It is not often one sees gay characters in India. In this collection, you see two. It's not, I don't know, just a statement. There was no question.
Mhm.
Um, do you have a response to this statement?
Yeah,
Or.
I do think that gay characters, lesbian characters are underrepresented in Indian literature, but at the same time, there is actually a very large body of work. I'm going to just talk about Assamese literature because
Mhm.
Indian literary traditions are so big. In fact, one of the greatest writers from Assam, Mamuni Resam Goswami, Indira
Mhm.
Goswami, one of her characters called Horace, I forgot his name, but the novel is called Uday Bhanu's Charitra.
Mhm.
In that there is a gay character who is attracted to Uday Bhanu, and he plays a very important role in the novel.
Mhm.
And There is a writer called Orup Kumar Nath who has written a novella called Nihidha Hilar Hilalipi, and he has it's a novel about homosexual experience in Assam. I think one of the very famous Bengali books called Holude Gulab, which means I think yellow roses, got the Ananda Purashkar also, which is about the LGBTQ community in Bengal. And in Assamese, there are many other writers, such as Jayanta Khoikia has written about homosexuality. Monikuntala Bhattacharya has written a novel about homosexuality, or centering on homosexual experience, called Mukti. There is also one of the very famous critics and writers from Assam called Govinda Prasad Sharma. He has written also a novel on two lesbian characters. And I think there is a lot of examples. New writers also are writing about these things more explicitly and with much more bravery in Assamese. I wouldn't entirely agree with the statement that we don't see gay characters or queer characters
Mhm.
in Indian literature. There are lots more examples, of course. Anybody can just look at the book Same Sex Love in India, which is an anthology of writings from the ancient times to the modern period on the queer experience in India. So they would find a lot of examples.
You think the reason why you get questions like this is also because, in terms of literary traditions in India, the English writing, while it only reaches a very small group of people, still seems to dominate in terms of visibility, in terms of marketing, in terms of, um, for example, I didn't know any of these writers. Like, while I know, I've discovered you, and I know a few other handful of Assamese writers who have been translated. As a Tamilian, I'm never going to have access to the kind of rich literary heritage that you are so immersed in. And similarly, I'm sure as an Assamese writer, I'm sure there's no way for you to discover Tamil writers were not translated into English. So do you think that plays also a huge role in terms of people discovering new works?
Yes, absolutely. You are exactly spot on. one of the biggest challenges that we face as a nation is, of course, language, which is both unifying and also a force that divides us. But because English writing from India or the Indian subcontinent gets a lot of attention, gets the bulk of the attention, that is the reason why actually writers from the regional literary cultures are not focused. I think this has changed a lot in the last 20 years, especially because of literary awards or literary festivals, publishing houses taking the task of publishing literature from regional languages far more seriously. But it has to also happen in a global level. I think global literary awards that are interested in Indian literature or are interested in literature from the global south should take more and more translated literature into consideration while they are. I've seen some welcome developments in the last 10-20 years, such as the Man Booker International Prize, but also the National Book Award, starting the translation category in the United States. But these are all actually droplets in an ocean. So we have to do more. Otherwise, we will not be exposed to this really sort of rich body of work. My exposure to various Indian writers who wrote in different languages was actually through the translations of National Book Trust, and I used to read them when I was young. And in fact, read a lot of them in Assamese because National Book Trust translated from one Indian language to another Indian language. I also read a lot of Sahitya Academy translations, but I think these organizations should be funded. They should be strengthened so that these works are taken to a broader community of readers. And India as a country has always translated. If you look at just the Ramayana, how it has traveled everywhere. It has been translated to so many Indian languages. Assam, I can talk about two different Ramayanas. The first Indo-Aryan language Ramayana was written actually in Assamese, by Madhav Kandali in the 11th century. There's also a folk Ramayana called Durgaburi Ramayana. There's another folk Ramayana called Karbi Ramayana. These are three Ramayanas in Assam. They were all translated to different languages. So translation is very much part of Indian literature. Without translation, we would only be poorer. So we have to continue working. But I think because of the epistemological violence that happened because of colonialism, that is primarily the reason why we are here today, talking primarily Indian English writers and not writers from other languages as much as we should.
Uh, Sonia Kamal has another comment. She says, enjoying this conversation so much. Aruni, absolutely spot on about underrepresentation of writers. So, yeah, so
Thank you.
that takes us to a very naughty question from one of our audience. And they
Okay.
say, who do you like better? Aruni? Aruni the writer, Aruni the translator, or Aruni the editor?
Oh, okay. That's really. I love that question. I think I would say I love Aruni the writer, who writes fiction and who writes fiction every morning and then deletes it the next day. That's the Aruni I love more. I think the Aruni the translator and Aruni the writer are versions of me that has emerged due to a
Mm-hmm.
sense of responsibility. I think this is the kind of invisible labor that any writer from underrepresented literary culture has to do. And because I wanted to create a sense of community, I wanted to, that is why I started a journal with two other friends to promote writers from underrepresented culture, but primarily from Northeast, three other friends. Then I also translate because I really love some Assamese writing and I want to take it out to a broader audience. I get so little time to translate, but I also absolutely love them. So this, I think that I do it as a more as a sense of duty. In the same way, I edited the story collection that came out in February called "How to Tell the Story of an Insurgency" because I thought that there were so little narratives
Mm-hmm.
from Assam, and in the absence of narratives. There was ignorance, and ignorance was leading to racism and many other different kinds of social viruses. So I wanted to do my bit, and I hoped that this collection would encourage other people to also edit and translate stories from Assam, Nagaland, Arunachal, Manipur, or any other place that needs more representation in the wider literary sphere.
I actually want to. I had a bunch of questions, so I'm going to kind of set aside the audience questions for a while and ask you some of the questions that I had on the back of my mind as I was reading through this. Is how did this book come by? Um, Bhakti, we have a question from Bhakti. So the Queen has spoken, so we have to take the
Yes.
question from
Our
her. So
company.
Bhakti says, how does Aruni, the professor, navigate teaching American creative writing students? Uh, pluses and minuses.
Okay. All right. So then after that, you can ask your question
Yes, I'll
first.
ask. So since the
No.
Queen has spoken, we let the Queen
Yeah.
ask, and then I'll
Uh,
come in.
Um, I actually blend my syllabi with a lot of writings from all over the world, and that leads to many exciting conversations in the class. So if I teach, for example, for dialogue, Hemingway, which is taught and taught and taught, and I love Hemingway, and but my students have also read. They all somebody will always raise their hand and say this is the iceberg method of writing, but they already know it.
Hmm.
So to bring a writer such as Ashapurna Devi, who writes amazing dialogues, amazing fun dialogues, actually, very quick. And her work is available in translation. Bringing her not only enables me to talk about a writer who wrote, like 170 novels and 3,000 short stories in Bengali for in a career spanning over 70 years. But also another literary conversations about another literary culture, or if I teach a writer from say Nigeria or South Africa, someone like Nadine Godimer who rarely uses dialogue tags or he said, she said, who is speaking, she doesn't really sort of mention all of this. So it's amazing to teach dialogue with Nadine Godimer by using Nadine Godimer's fiction. So I do that very often. So that's how I navigate. But I also teach basically when I design my syllabi and when I teach my classes, I use my favorite writers. I used the new writers that I have discovered, and that's the philosophy and guiding principle with which I teach my classes. But I have lots to say about the American creative writing pedagogy, but that must be for another conversation. But this is how I approach my classes. That's a brilliant conversation, but Bhakti, that's like a seminar. Like we have to organize a conference for that, where I will invite probably many more people to come and talk.
Okay, so I will help you organize it. Bhakti
Sure.
can do the closing keynote, and
Yes.
then you can do the opening keynote, and we can line it up with everybody else in between, and and then
Yes.
it's going to be fun. So
Yes.
we'll do it
I
once.
That's a post-coronavirus idea. Brilliant one. Yeah.
Yes. So yes. So my question for you: how did this book come together? Because this book is so different. Because when I was reading this book and preparing for this conversation, I also went back. Um, I also went back and read the first book, The House of Thousand Stories. Such remarkably different books in terms of tone, in terms of texture, in terms of length. Why this departure? Because when I first remember reading this book, my initial instinct was that Aruni would write another story, lot more rich, lot richer, more intense, but never a collection of short stories. Talk to me about this process of writing the book of thousand stories to now writing this collection of short stories.
Yes. After I wrote House of the Thousand Stories, I actually wrote three novellas in Assamese, and they were published in Assamese periodicals. So I was enjoying talking to people in Assam by writing in Assamese. After that, I was requested by a magazine to write a novel for a special issue. And I think Assamese and Bengali, and I don't know about other language cultures in India, but most probably this practice of writing a periodic episodic novel exists. In Assamese, we call it Dharabahik Upanyakh, which is the serialized novels. So I was requested by an editor who I really admire to write a novel called something called that we call Hompurna Upanyak or Sampurna Upanyak, which means in one issue the novel will be over. So it is like a novella, but slightly longer than
Mm.
novella. Um, and but I started writing it, and I told the editor that, Dada, I can't write this in one episode. It would need a few more episodes. So he said, "Can you condense it in 6, 7 episodes? I will publish it because I like the concept." So that kept me busy for 2 more years. Actually, though I thought I would write 6 episodes. I ended up writing about 20 episodes. That led to this book called Noikonetia Deroit, and it is my first full-length novel in Assamese, which was just published in December. And that book is surprisingly set actually entirely in Minnesota and very briefly in Assam, because I studied in Minnesota, lived there, and it was my first exposure to the United States and experience of being an immigrant. So what I'm trying to say is that I have been writing consistently, but I have been writing in Assamese and writing short stories in Assamese, writing essays in Assamese. After that, on the side, I just write a lot and I throw away a lot. So on the side, I wrote about 20, 25 short stories. Some of them were published, some of them are not published, some of them are commissioned. Then I decided to publish a collection by choosing from 10 of the stories. But of course, I got help from my editor and my literary agent to curate these stories. But when he when I was thinking about, I wanted to put together stories that would sort of comment on a diseased, broken, rotten state that has created and displaced many people from the Northeast. In my case, right, characters from Assam. Every story, every story where every character in every story, if a character has left Assam or left the village or left the city, is because of the long shadow of the insurgency, which is the product of the diseased, broken, rotten state that could not protect its own citizens. So I wanted to think about disease as a very elaborate metaphor that would force characters to get out of the country, get out of the city, get out of the villages, get out of the country, but would never be safe because as a result of that, the short story Before the Bullet, the guy who comes back from Indiana to rural Assam after completing his PhD for after 6 years, I think he's not safe because he comes to a war ravaged, insurgency torn village, which is kind of ruled by this. By almost the Indian security forces, and they take his presence, who is more worldly wise, as a threat, and decide to exterminate him. And in the same way, even Matt and Raj, the gay couple, who are in rural in small town Midwest. And they are also not safe from social viruses like racism and homophobia, even in their own family. And Raj has left Assam because he thought that he would be safe. Safe left the country and left the state. So these were some of the guiding thoughts that went behind putting together the collection. That is a really great question, by the way. Thank you so much.
We have another. I do want to come back to this question of violence very soon. But we have another question from Manjari who says, a question for Dr. Kashyap. How do you accommodate the multiplicity of your culture and community? Even as I write this, I find myself relying on singular nouns. When there is so much pressure for writers from underrepresented backgrounds to represent that background? Or is that something you try to avoid thinking about while writing?
Yeah,
These are really good questions. I
yeah,
feel
very
like
good
I
question.
think.
And I'm proud to say that Manjari was, if this is Manjari Sahai, she was
Uh huh.
probably a student back in India. So anyway, thank you, Manjari. Even if you're not Manjari Sahai, thank you, Manjari, for the question. I always think about my experience and what I have seen in when I'm trying to write stories set in the contemporary times in Assam, and it's I don't try to represent anything. I'm trying to just talk about my experience and the people who I know, their experience. As long as I'm true to my literary consciousness and social consciousness, I think I'm safe. That has been my principle and guiding light when I write my stories. And it is true that coming from a place like Northeast, or even coming from a place like India, we are in it's a confluence of so many languages, so many experiences, and I think this multiplicity, this polyphony, is something that we embody. And it may not be the experience of Indians who primarily speak only in English and has lived a different kind of life than say mine, where I had a very rural experience as well as small town experience, because my parents are both from rural Assam and small town Assam. As a result, I had this multiplicity of experiences. I can speak many dialects in Assamese. I have spent a lot of time in my relatives' houses, which are in rural Assam, that exposed me to different facets of the state, not just in terms of people, but also in terms of ethnicity, language, politics, and a wide range of characters. And I think one of the questions somebody asked before this was, do I write from my uh, personal experience? I do, but at the same time, because of the experience of growing up so much in Guwahati and as well as Tetliguri and Mayong, I usually actually just draw from this experience. There are so many interesting characters and people that I can't probably exhaust. If so, I already have a very I feel very fortunate to have this reservoir.
We have another question from Sonia Kamal. She says, "How do you decide which stories to write in Assamese and which in English, or does the voice just come?" And also, Manjari says, "So happy to be listening to you." It's her. I think it is your student. So she says hi as well.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you, Sonia, for the question, and hi, Manjari. Yes, actually, Sonia, you are a writer, so you already answered the question for me. I wait for the voice to come. For example, I tried writing The House with a Thousand Stories in Assamese, but I failed. I did publish a first chapter. I hope anybody who has the issue of the magazine where the first chapter of House with a Thousand Stories was published, please find it and burn that section where I published the first chapter translated to Assamese, because now the book is translated by Khamon Fukon. He is a PhD scholar at Tezpur Central University, and it's a beautiful translation. And I could have never done it. And I'm saying this despite the fact that I write in Assamese, and I'm very comfortable writing in Assamese. So this brings back to my question that until and unless I hear the voice, I am not able to write. I can't write it. So I heard Pablo speaking to me only in English. If I have to write House with a Thousand Stories in first person again, I would have to write it from a person who doesn't know English. If I have to rewrite it in Assamese, I would have to write it from the perspective and point of view or the voice of a person who doesn't speak English. Because Pablo spoke English, I was able to capture his voice. So yes, absolutely, that's right. I wait for the story to form and cook and bake in my head, actually.
That I want now to kind of move into the realm of the book again. The question of violence. And for me, the question of violence seems to occupy you in throughout both of the works that I've read and engaged with. Of course, with this, you try to um, disrupt it in interesting ways. But I was also wondering if how much of this violence is also connected to your idea of home. I feel another theme that somehow seems to run through this book, that's my reading of it. Again, I could be completely wrong, is in addition to this idea of this disease that mutates and travels, it's also the idea of home that mutates, travels, falls apart. Some manage to find some other kinds of homes, but most of them actually don't. I was just kind of wondering if you can talk about that a bit.
A disease that mutates and travel. I mean, I could have never said it in such beautiful words. Thank you. And you were very spot on when you talk about the idea of home, because some of these stories were part of my MFA thesis, and I had to write a critical introduction, and it was about home.
Okay.
I don't remember what I wrote so long ago, so many years ago, but I did talk about home because I think home as a metaphor for the nation, home as a microcosm for the nation. But at the same time, my idea of home has been so fraught, especially my generation that grew up in Assam in the 80s and 90s, born in the late 70s or born in the late 80s. For our idea of home is so fraught. I'd given a chance, most of us probably would have not moved out. But we had to move out because right from I think it was fifth standard, my parents were saying you have to study well because you have to go out of the state and make sure you have enough
Mm-hmm.
marks so that you get an admission in a good college. So this was the pressure that I was grown up with, and this was the pressure that a lot from my generation grew up with. And at that point of time, I think in the last 10 years or so, a lot more new education institutions of national repute have emerged in Assam. During the time, it was just there were only a handful. So we had no other option but to leave. But another reason we left was because of violence. My mother was a professor in Cotton College before became a university. Now it is a Cotton College State University, a very large university. It's also the oldest education institution of higher learning, probably in Assam, and definitely in Assam, but also probably in the Northeast. And I saw many of our students worrying about their ability to go and write the exams because there would be a shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think at any given point of time, there was a point of time when I think there are about 40 insurgent groups operating in Assam, and someone or the other would call for a band or a
Mm-hmm.
shutdown, and that would mean that people are not support. Even if people didn't support the band, they would be terrified enough to stay at home. So this lockdown, actually, coronavirus lockdown, is not absolutely shocking to me because I've grown up so much like that. We used to have lockdowns like this because any insurgent organization would call for a banner, and everything would be disrupted. Nobody would be able to get out of the house. Shops will be shut. You cannot travel. So, and I have seen people even losing academic years because of that. And my parents knew it far more viscerally. So they said you have to get out of the state. And I remember the year I think I traveled out of the state to take admission in Delhi University. There was like a rough estimate done by one of the newspapers, if I remember correctly. They said about 12,000 students from Assam had moved to Delhi just to take admission in universities around Delhi because they wanted better opportunities, a more stable academic environment, a functioning library where there is internet, where you can go and find academic databases. Those facilities were either very limited or job opportunities are so limited that people had to move out. So for me, home, I love my home. I love Assam. Every time I go back to Assam, I come back replenished. But I am not in Assam because of historical and social factors. And in some ways, I would call myself that I was displaced because of the violence in Assam, like many in my generation. Again, the later generations, especially who were born after the mid 90s, they have seen a little bit safer Assam. And a lot of them have been able to make the choice of living in Assam and staying in Assam and pursuing careers in Assam. And I'm very happy for them. But yes, home is fraught because of violence.
And that also brings us to two things that are kind of playing out in Assam right now. A different kind of violence through the NRC process that has now led to so many others being held in detention center. The visceral, amputation of identity and remaking of identity. But also, what else is kind of playing out in Assam right now? This sense of trying to remake a sense of who belongs to Assam and who doesn't. Along with these protests, and along with protests comes repression, and then Assamese Maya poets were actually charged with sedition simply for writing poetry. And this doesn't even sound like a parody anymore. And you, as a writer who engages with the political history of Assam in such ways, I wanted to hear your thoughts about what's happening in India, but also, as a writer, your own fears for safety, your sense of where does one get to speak the truth? Is there the space for truth anymore left?
I think that space for truth was challenged even in the 80s. And the erosion happened then. There is one of the major writers and journalists of Assam called Parag Kumar Das. He was shot dead in May 1997. He was a very famous, popular journalist and novelist. He's the one who actually wrote about Delhi's discrimination of Assam consistently, and he became an eyesore in the eyes of the government or any kind of forces that supported the government. And he was shot dead in front of his son's school when he went to get his son. And he was a very famous journalist. I still remember the day when he was killed. Somebody started talking in our colony that Parag Das has been shot, and everyone in my house ran out to the gates, and my mother was crying. She didn't even know him that well, probably, but there are people who loved him just because of his writing, and they saw that he could do something. And Parag Das's career was marked by with seizure of newspaper issues, banning of books, or seizure of unpublished books, and so on. Censorship has always existed. Now it has found, obviously, under the current regime in its most brutal forms. And it has been, the groundwork was laid by earlier government, Congress and EGP, when they attacked authors or when they didn't support authors. Now we are seeing the theater of cruelty when after the stage was laid out, in the form of poets, Mia poets being filed challenge which cases of sedition. Um, but Assamese writers have continued to critique the state in different forms. But I do think that uh, in regional writing, the space for explicit criticism by naming the spade as a spade has largely been eroded. I'm not going to speak about the rest of regional literary cultures because I'm not as familiar, but I'm very worried how that space has been taken away, and also how writers have been co opted repeatedly by the establishment, by either giving them awards and fellowships and so on. And if they're not co-opted, they are seen as an eyesore, and they are silenced in some of the other ways. So that space in original writing is a very precarious tightrope, very precarious space at this point.
So we have another. Okay. So we have Amy Tidwell who says, "Longtime fan of your work. How does one get a copy? How does one get a copy of your new book?" I'm
Oh,
assuming Amy is. I'm assuming Amy. Amy, are you in the United States or UK? So yeah. So how does one get a copy of your book?
yeah, Amy is someone, is a longtime friend. Amy, you can buy it online, and if you don't find it, I can send you a link, probably by email later. Yeah,
Okay, and I just quickly want to like just show off this book cover, which is so beautiful. I know it sounds a little thing, but it's beautiful. It's just a wonderful cover. I love it.
I love the cover as well. Absolutely. Yeah, and,
Um,
I'm so grateful to my publishers for coming up with a beautiful cover. Everyone talks about the cover. They in fact sent me this beautiful plaque also. Uh,
oh,
I have it always on my bookshelf.
you know what? I'm going to after this call. I'm going to quickly email Ajita and demand that she sends me a large poster version of this. So I'm
Yes,
going to, because the thing that I've started doing now is I've started putting works of my friends on the wall. So if you see, you'll
absolutely.
see Alana Hunt's work
Oh,
from Cups
okay.
of Noon Chai. So I face this
Right.
wall when I write. So it's a wall of all my friends, and yeah. So
That's
I'm
lovely.
I'm going to get Ajita to send me a poster of this book cover so I can frame it and put it out there. We have another anonymous question. So it's interesting. Anonymous questions are interesting. Why doesn't one see you in the literary festival circuit? Have you, like Arundhati Roy, boycotted all these neoliberal spaces? Follow same person. Another question. I feel that Indian writing, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, is dominated by children of famous people or people who come from immense privilege. Often reading these writers, mostly men. I, sorry, there's often reading. Okay, there's a lot of mistakes. Reading these men is a very alienating experience. Aruni, as a writer who comes from local traditions, did you feel and face the same sense of alienation of not coming from immense privilege?
I
Sorry,
think
I
that
had to rephrase that a bit. The second question I had to rephrase because the words were,
okay.
yeah. And also,
Yeah.
Sonia says, wall of love and respect. Gorgeous idea. So thank you,
Thank
Sonia.
you. Yeah. Um, by the way, I have the posters of my favorite novels and
Mm-hmm.
books, blown up and framed.
Oh, lovely.
Posters actually. So yeah, so I really second that idea. The first question, I think, no, I haven't boycotted literary festivals, but I would be very careful, obviously, before choosing one. Well, one of the reasons I don't go to a lot of Indian literary festival because not everyone invites me. I take every opportunity to go to India. If somebody comes and says, "We'll pay for your tickets and can you come and show your face for 2 hours?" I
Mm-hmm.
just go, even if it is in the most remotest part,
Mm-hmm.
because that gives me an opportunity to visit India when I'm here. Uh, And I think there's a long debate about how the neoliberal literary culture works in the current world. That's again another conversation. Uh, and I do think there are many interesting and exciting women writers in Indian English writing. So many of them are there. There is, I mean, I think we both know. I mean, there is Annie Zadie who's writing
Yes.
wonderful work right now. Meena
We were just
Kandasamy,
reaching. I was just reading one of her essays, and I thought it was pretty
Annie writes
phenomenal.
days. I loved her first book, Known Turf, and I read her for a very, very long time. There's Meena Kandasamy who has been writing such amazing work, and of course, I think the best Indian writers in English. A lot of them are also women. I mean, Arundhati Roy is there, Shashi Deshpande is there. I mean, if you want to include Jhumpa Lahiri as definitely, all of so I think there is a long list of women writers that we can always recommend this person. But I understand that Indian English literary culture definitely is burdened by privilege and pedigree, because so much of this is about access, and which is slowly changing right now. Again, I believe that someone from of my background who has no connection in the Indian English literary scene was able to get published. But I think so much of this is related to what kind of mentors you have, what kind of institutions you go to. The publishing culture is very, very biased in definitely in London and New York. They a lot of it is decided by many different factors, such as and a lot and it has to do with access to privilege, access to privileged cultures, access to even the kind of training one would get, because I think if you go to a good school or a good university, you get a lot more feedback on your writing when you are growing up, and you build a cohort that would stay with you lifelong, and those are factors that actually feed into your writing and push you in different ways. So I agree that there is an
Yeah.
issue of privilege.
I'm also very curious that this person used the word alienating. You know, it's a very powerful word, and this is a conversation I've had with many of my friends who say that often they don't see themselves being reflected in the books, the literatures, and the cultures that they read. I was once remember having this long conversation. We were all in this. This is almost 15 years ago. I was in this very fancy person's house. I was very surprised. I was even invited, and everybody was talking about how their family has the first gun that was ever bought to India. How their families things are in archives, and very alienating for me. So I left the party with another person who was in the party, and I was just going on and on about, oh my god, this is so alienating for me, and who are these people, like, and I said, it was, as a middle class person, how my dad would order the Telegraph newspaper for JTS George's column, so that while the newspaper would arrive a day later, you would just still read it. And so
Yes.
I was talking about as if that was, not privilege. And then the person I was with then looked at me and said, Suchitra, you should check your privilege, because I didn't even know people bought newspapers till I came to University of Hyderabad as a postgraduate student. And that for me was a moment to realize that just as I could find someone whose family donates archives and endows buildings can
Mm.
be, or doesn't think these things, that I forget to realize that the access to the newspaper, access to book, food, shelter, clothing are also immensely uh, objects of privilege that not everybody gets. And that for me kind of takes back to the characters in your book. I know we've talked about dialogue. The characters in your book, how do you create them? Do they come to you? Do you work at them? Tell us the ideas of how do you sculpt these remarkable characters and make them come alive on book.
Thank you. I always draw from real experience, and I always use something called a zip code method.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about a character, I always think about where is this person from,
Mm-hmm.
and usually when we think about where is this person from, their accent, the things that are going to be important
Mm-hmm.
for them, their sense of fashion, their sense of
Mm-hmm.
the world. their sense of their relationship with weather, their relationship with food, their favorite food. All of these come. I think about. I usually know everything about every character that I actually include in my stories or my essays. In fact, there are two stories in this collection that are about a character called O'Neill, who is a very important character in my first novel. But these stories I could not include in the novel, so they formed into independent stories. Also, these stories explore O'Neill's sexuality, which was not mentioned but only hinted upon in the first novel, in my novel. So. A lot of these characters I draw from real experience, as I said. Um, I combine the features and characteristics, distinctive features of multiple characters and create one. For example, I created an aunt once by using the life stories as well as by borrowing the life stories as well as distinctive characteristic traits of four of my aunts to create one and into this powerhouse, Jethai, or father's elder sister. So I think real life always will surprise us. This is a question that actually I often discuss in my classes because I teach creative writing for a living, and I always want to say that we are surrounded by very very interesting people, and if we observe, you will see that every person is unique and different from each other. And once we start observing them, we will start making mental notes. And when you sit down to write, all of this, everything that we ever experienced, seen, smelled, felt, heard comes into useful when we sit down to write. And I use my real experience to write. I don't go around thinking about creating a completely new character from scratch.
Since we're coming towards the end of our conversation, I'm still going to see if anyone has any last handful of questions. Um, does teaching make you a good writer? Do you feel that having now taught? I'm assuming that if I'm correct, you were not teaching when you wrote A House of Thousand Stories. Is that correct?
No, I was not teaching.
So
I revised House of a Thousand Stories when I was teaching. Yes,
Mhm.
but I wrote it and I signed the contract before I did my MFA.
So do you think teaching other young students in an American university has it made you a better writer? Has it made you a richer writer?
Yes, I do think so because it enables me to take apart my process with undergraduate students and as well as graduate students because I teach both levels and I learn different things from conversations with students at different levels and I always treat my students as peers because I know that we are all artists, but just at various levels in our life, in our maturity. So and I actually learn a lot from my students. For example, I never used to read fantasy and science fiction that much, but because my students keep recommending me, especially my undergraduate students, I have started reading them with an open mind, and I'm very much enjoying them. So what I'm trying to say is that teaching writing enables me to verbalize what would make for a good scene, what would make for good dialogue, what are the elements to make a good character, and when I verbalize them, I come back and apply them in my own writing as well. And that really really helps me. So I feel that my teaching and writing, they really complement each other. Sometimes a student would ask a question such as, how can I make setting more interesting? And I always say your setting should be like a character. People should feel that they're in that place. But what are the techniques of doing that? And that day I came up automatically with an answer that, think about the history of the place, think about the different lores and urban legends, think about the hookup places, think about where people go to get groceries, and all of these should cloud the character's mind, and that would create a very deep description of setting. And next day I was revising a story and I realized that I am not doing it myself, so that's why the story feels flat, and I did it and I felt better about the story. So yes, absolutely, teaching is very very enabling to me, and I look also forward to talk about the process
Mhm.
with people who are curious to know about the process, people who are serious about writing, people who are who are also interested in using writing as a serious mode of expression. And sometimes I have questions. Sometimes I ask my students, because I feel that they have taught me so much. So I ask them, what do you do when what should I do because my story is stuck here? So we discuss it sometimes with one or two students. So I feel that they're very, very important, teaching and writing, and they really sort of complement each other.
Aruni, what next? So we're already like the last 5 minutes. So tell us, what are the plans? What more can we? I think we're all hungry for more. So what can we expect in the years to come?
Well, I just finished writing a novel set in Guwahati,
Mm-hmm.
and about this, and I don't even know if this novel will ever be published. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying this at the risk of, you know, um, whatever. So I just finished writing this novel set in Guwahati about a woman, and this is a person who is real. Like, I read about this person on Huffington Post and Times of India, who has an Barack Obama altar in her house and is obsessed with Barack Obama. And she was so obsessed with Barack Obama that she decided to change her name to Archana Obama, from Archana Ojha, by filing an affidavit in the High Court in Assam. And I was really fascinated by this story. And I thought, if I could write something from the perspective of a character like that, and what would the character think in 2016 November when Trump came to power? How sad that person would be, because we were all very sad.
Mm-hmm.
And that what happened, that sent off a series of scenes in my mind, and became a novel. And I have finished the novel. I don't know where it'll go. I hope somebody will come and publish it.
Okay. Um, Aruni, thank you so much. As this conversation ends, we will be circulating this video on all our other platforms, and we will include links to both your books so that people can, get a hand, get a copy. But also, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I'm so sorry that we couldn't host you in public. I wish this was in a beautiful bookshop surrounded by more people, and then we could have finished it off with beautiful dinner and lots of alcohol with friends. But we will do that. We'll have another book launch in the public space. But then again, thank you so much for making this conversation possible.
Oh, thank you. And I really enjoyed. I can't believe we just spent 1 hour. It seemed to go so fast. Of course, I would have loved to meet you and everyone involved with the Polis project. And but we are living in very, very strange times.
Mm-hmm.
God knows what's going to happen 6 months down the line. And so maybe this is the new normal. Who knows? But I really hope this is not the new normal, and this will go, and we will thrive, and we'll laugh about these days several years down the line to that.
That sounds great. And for all of our audience joining us, please do, if you haven't already read and engaged with Ernie's work, please do buy a copy of these books. They are wonderful books. Second, at Polis Project, we believe that knowledge should be free, which also means that all of our programming, public programmings, have been free. I also want to give a quick shout out to Michael Bush, who is our Director of Public Programming, who not only brings all of us together, but has been instrumental in putting all of these conversations over the last 2 years. Also, if you are someone who loves the work we do consider becoming a patron on Polis Project's patron page. We're hoping to get to 500 patrons over the next 3 or 4 months so that, again, we do more of this work and we get more writers like Aruni to have these conversations. Thank you so much, Aruni. Thank you.
Thank you, Suchitra. Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone else at the Police Project. Thank you.
And Bhakti for introducing us 7 years
Yes,
ago.
and Bhakti for introducing us. Absolutely, yeah.
Take
Super.
care.
Take care.